Hello and welcome to the 6th episode of the Business of Possibility podcast with Ulster University Business School. I'm Wendy Austin, and in this series we've been diving deep into the world of business here in Northern Ireland, looking at how they're staying afloat in the current circumstances and even during a global pandemic, managing to innovate and demonstrate their true entrepreneurial spirit as well. In this episode, we'll be discussing creativity. Now, the pandemic has challenged businesses in all kinds of ways across all sorts of sectors to think differently and create new value in imaginative and creative ways. We have a couple of really great guests today. Dr. Natalie Nixon, who's President, Creative Strategist at Figure 8 Thinking and author of The Creativity Leap as well. Hi Natalie, good to have you with us. And also Dr. Michael Brennan, who's Senior Lecturer in Strategic Management at Ulster University Business School. Good to have you along, Mike, too. What we're going to do in the next half hour or so is get Natalie and Mike to share their thoughts on how creativity can pave the way for innovation and open up a whole new world of possibilities for businesses, including, of course, your own. Let's start by finding out a bit more about both of them, shall we? And get a bit of a brief introduction as to who they are, what they do, and how they got to where they are now. Natalie, maybe you'd like to start.
Yes, Wendy, thank you so much for having me. Hi, Michael. It's great to be here. I, as you've already mentioned, am a creativity strategist. I am based in Philadelphia in the United States, and I help leaders achieve transformative business results and transformation in general by applying creativity and foresight. I've gotten to this stage in my career through a very loopy background. I have a background in cultural anthropology and fashion. I was also a professor for 16 years, and I've been building out my company, Figure 8 Thinking, for the last 3 years. And I recently published a new book called The Creativity Leap: Unleash Curiosity, Improvisation, and Intuition at Work.
So that's a really interesting background you've got, and we're going to delve into a bit of that as we're talking today. Michael, what about you?
Okay, so I'm a native of Belfast, where my family had a small engineering company for many years. So I had a very early introduction to the practicalities of running a business. At university, of course, I studied science, and to help me prepare for small business, I decided to study archaeology.
Interesting.
And computer science. So I did that mainly from a scientific perspective. After university, I worked for a couple of years as an archaeologist whilst managing a family business. So it was a very busy time. The archaeology stuff is very interesting because as I go abroad, it's a really great icebreaker. So I'm interested in Natalie's anthropology background. It's a really, I think having a different strings to your bow in a sense is very, very important when you're doing business and being creative. So twin tracks are small business and science. I've always had an interest in education and learning, so I picked up an accountancy qualification. I've got an MBA from Ulster, and I completed my PhD in innovation entrepreneurship. So I've been, eventually I got into teaching part-time, then full-time. And I teach on the MBA program, the executive MBA program at the moment. Right now, what I'm doing is I'm working on 2 very large international projects dealing with researchers in Latin America and Asia and Africa, and really trying to investigate things related to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So, like Natalie, it's not a conventional background, but it's hopefully, well, I've found it an interesting journey. So there we go.
Fascinating, both of you actually, and you've perhaps more in common than we might have thought at the beginning. Yeah. Natalie, I wonder if you'd like to give us your thoughts on what it actually means to be creative and how important creativity is, particularly at the present time as organizations are having to, as well as perhaps wanting to, adapt and change.
Yeah, so I've been giving quite a lot of thought to what is creativity and its significance right now. I like to think about creativity as toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems, and also produce novel value at scale. And that value could be financial value, social value, cultural value. But it was very important to me to offer up a simple an accessible definition of creativity, which is this idea of toggling between wonder and rigor for problem solving. And wonder is about awe, audacity, asking big blue sky, what if questions. It's also about pausing. Rigor is about discipline, time on task, and deep focus. And rigor is not particularly sexy. It's often very solitary work, but it's really important to keep in mind that both are essential for any creative endeavor. And right now, in this time of what I've been calling a triple pandemic, a pandemic that's impacting us on a global scale, on a social dimension, health dimension, environmental dimension. I'm talking about COVID-19, systemic racism, and the unsustainability of our earth. These are days designed for creativity, because we are not going to be able to navigate such complex, sticky, air quotes, wicked challenges with a linear Gantt chart. I call it the chewing gum method. The best way to navigate complexity is with complexity. The best way to get chewing gum off your skin is with more chewing gum. And it turns out that creativity is a complex system. So it's absolutely essential right now that organizations, companies, our educational institutions look for ways to cultivate and sustain creativity.
Michael, what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, I agree with all of that. Basically, what I find is that creativity and innovation are often used interchangeably as terms, but ultimately I think creativity, as Natalie said, is about problem solving. I think it's where you can think of problems in different ways from alternative perspectives, but also to challenge assumptions about the nature of a problem, because often when we try to solve problems, we're solving the wrong type of problem. So I think creativity is a thinking process. It's also obviously linked to innovation, which is the doing of it. It's actually trying to make some sort of tangible impact in some situation. And I also link those two terms with entrepreneurship, which is the pursuit of opportunity. So those three terms together, I think, are a critical way of engaging with change and development, and especially now we have COVID, where every single business model, it seems, every single established way of working is being challenged, and it really needs this agility to move between creativity, innovation, and actually making some sort of entrepreneurial pursuit of an impact. So it's that those things together, I think, are really important for change for organizations.
I mean, Natalie, this whole crisis has very much changed the focus on human behaviours, hasn't it? I suppose that wasn't necessarily one of the things we expected when we got into it all, but it's highlighted qualities like humility and compassion and resilience, and it's brought out and underlined the importance of curiosity and creativity and a whole new kind of leadership, given that there isn't that sort of human interaction. Leaders have had to work in many ways in a very different way. I mean, can anyone be creative, or is it only creative people who can be creative?
Yes, anyone can be creative. I want to disavow us of this term, the creatives or creative types or the creative team will work on X, Y, Z. To be human is to be hardwired to be creative. And I love, Wendy, that you just referenced qualities like humility, like resilience. We have these, in my view, unfortunate terms like soft skills, because we know that we tend in our society, unfortunately, we don't endow softness as strength. We don't endow softness as a virtue and as really as a tactic to build, as a tactic and a competency. But the World Economic Forum since 2015 has been identifying creativity as was within the top 10 job skills of the world for 2020 and beyond. Well, hello 2020, we're here. And actually by 2016, they said, actually, it's going to be like the number 3 job skill in the world. And so when I say to be human is to be hardwired to be creative, I'm absolutely serious about that. If we look at our own children, if we think about ourselves as children, we were always juxtaposing things that air quotes should not go together. We were always exercising what I call the 3 I's, which are inquiry or curiosity. We're hyper curious as little people. We're always improvising, and being improvisational is about being adaptive. It's about embracing self-organization and emergence. And we were much more attuned to our intuition, that nudge, that feeling that I should go left and not right. And I interviewed over 50 people from a range of sectors, from law, technology, healthcare, education, farmers, plumbers, estheticians, to understand how creativity shows up in their work. To a successful leader, they all credit intuition, for example, as being an important part of their problem-solving process and their decision-making process. Unfortunately, we don't touch intuition in business school, law school, medical school, and yet when we are actually, when the how do we say, when the metal hits the road, when the rubber hits the road, it's an American expression I've just botched, but anyway, when it really comes down to it, paying attention to that, what I call brain feelings or pattern recognition, that's really what intuition is, it's essential.
How is creativity dealt with, Michael, in somewhere like the Ulster University Business School? You know, as Natalie says, intuition tends not to be taught in academic institutions, and there are situations that we've all been in where people have talked about the creatives or the creative team. But is it now an intrinsic part of what actually goes on?
I think one of the key things is that academics are organized into disciplines, and that's the strength, because you can devote a lot of time to developing expertise and creating solutions to problems. But the strength of that is also its greatest weakness. And one of the things that I've spent a lot of time doing is working outside my own discipline with engineers, with scientists, with health practitioners, and also with non-governmental organizations in places like Mexico and Colombia and Brazil. And it's really, that is actually quite a surprising revelation to see that the way we do things in different disciplines is actually radically different. I mean, how you validate information and knowledge changes quite radically. So I've spent a lot of my time over the last couple of years trying to understand how you solve problems. And a lot of that is deconstructing a problem into multiple facets and then trying to systematically address those. So whenever you're dealing with the global water challenge, it's actually quite it's a very, very serious issue. It kills a lot of people each year. And seeing how different communities deal with that is actually quite an insightful lesson. So I try to do it from a very practical perspective. It can be very demanding because people aren't talking the same scientific or language, if you like. So the research suggests that trying to understand multiple perspectives is really important. I mean, a very good example actually is the COVID crisis, where we've seen how that crisis is not just a scientific problem, it's also a management problem, it's a business problem, it's a societal problem. So that gives you the sense that creativity is trying to reconcile or at least understand the multiple facets of a problem like that. And no single way of tackling COVID is going to win, because there's a trade-off. So what takes priority? How do we make decisions? And that's the creative response we've seen in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, and throughout the UK, in fact, multiple creative attempts to solve this problem with varying degrees of success. So to answer your question, I think creativity is really about recognizing that siloed thinking, the way we're organized, is not necessarily the best way to deal with problem solving.
Can I build on what Michael was just saying? I totally agree with you, Michael, that one of the things that COVID requires of us is a creative act, and specifically the creative act of reframing, which is another way of my way of building on what you were saying. And especially here in the United States, to really deal with COVID-19 effectively, which is a systems challenge, it requires systems thinking, you realize that COVID-19 is actually an educational challenge. It's actually a housing challenge. It's actually a transportation challenge, right? So you begin to appreciate the nuances and the complexity and understanding this puzzle from various different angles. And that is the gift of us all being able to exercise our creativity. And it's why I say that the days of uncertainty are designed for creativity, for us to embrace cognitive diversity, to have people around us who don't look like us, who aren't from our backgrounds, who have very different training and educational backgrounds and age perspective, geographic perspective, et cetera, et cetera. It's essential to really be able to effectively deal with a gnarly, difficult challenge.
That's very interesting, because I suppose in some ways that's harnessing creativity in the everyday work environment, particularly the current work environment with COVID, and bringing about innovation. But I wonder, what are the practical ways, Natalie, that business leaders can encourage creativity from employees at all levels within the organization? I mean, I don't know about you two, but I've heard a lot of very interesting stories about how, in a kind of weird way, working from home and the way that we're working now has minimize the gap in some instances between the leaders and the worker bees. There's been more interaction in some circumstances. So how do you get business leaders to encourage that creativity, no matter where people are working?
Well, I'll share three tactical examples. One is for leaders to embrace this time as an opportunity to become inquiry-based leaders, to lead with questions, which will require them to be more vulnerable and humble. I wrote it in the Creativity Leap that the precursor to empathy is curiosity. I know, especially in the design thinking field, we talk about empathy, empathize with the people who are buying your goods and services. But really, before you can empathize with anybody, you have to be curious. You have to ask a different and new questions, like, why do they do it this way and not our way? Why do they sit over there and not over here? And that begins the process of empathy. So for leaders to model curiosity, to model self-inquiry, to be brave enough to say, we've always done it this way. Clearly, this isn't working. Or even if it seems to be working, or kind of hanging on with a thread, we can't assume that the same sorts of inputs are going to continue to work. So first, modeling that curiosity, and then encouraging questions. And the best way to encourage questions in a company is to incentivize it. If it becomes part of performance review, if it becomes something where you have some budget set aside, incentivize people with money, you can incentivize people with time. Right? And speaking of time, my second example of, on a practical level, how to do this is to really engage in what's called lateral thinking. And in my book, The Creativity Leap, I gave it, each chapter ends with a creativity leap tip for an individual and for an organization. And of course, I wrote this pre-COVID, and one of the tips was ask members of your team, if you're a leader, if you're not a leader, volunteer, suggest it to leadership, that you, members of your team, are required to attend a conference in a totally different sector. And I just posted about this on LinkedIn. So if you work in education, attend a conference in transportation. If you work in healthcare, attend a conference in fashion. Because what that begins to do is two things. One, you begin to see the way people over there solve problems is very similar to the way we do it, but I learned this version 1.2 way of adding value to the way we do it. The other thing that will come out of it is you'll say, wow, we totally handle that sort of challenge in a very different way. That's super interesting. What does that look like in our context? So how do you do that during COVID? You can't, there's no conferences in person happening. Attend webinars that, you could easily attend a webinar where you're a fly on the wall, where it just requires a registration. Be curious and bring that learning back to your team. Don't hold it inside, but share it out. And then the third tactic I've really been encouraging my own clients, and it's scary, is what I call redesign your relationship with time. And we all have become victims of Zoom Palooza or Teams Palooza or whatever the platform is. And, you know, in small iterative steps, say, okay, on Tuesdays, we will only be scheduling Zoom meetings from 10 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. And then if we want to go crazy, Mondays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, fine. And then the pushback, of course, is, oh, but what if the client needs us? Well, it's fascinating when you begin to draw boundaries around time with explaining that we value our people, and we know that our people will show up more productive. It does wonders where people draw back and they say, oh, that's interesting, maybe we should try that. And so that's just a baby step. And I'm not saying every day do that, or Monday, Wednesday, Friday do that, but what's a way you could prototype that new way of working, redesigning your relationship with time so that in the morning people have more time with their family, or to sleep in, or to walk, or to do deep dive work, and vice versa in the afternoon. So those are three things I would recommend.
It is such a different working environment at the moment. And I wonder, Michael, you know, what are your views on how creativity can be used to encourage innovation? You've been looking at this, haven't you? I mean, what does your research tell you?
Well, just to pick up on what Natalie said there, I think the issue about time is really, really interesting. I mean, there's a case study I used to do about an industrialist called Ricardo Semler in Brazil. And his company, Semco, is a very interesting example of how employees and management can change their attitude towards time. So he would say that we don't buy time, we don't buy an employee's time, we buy talent. So that's what Natalie was saying, that you can spend your, the 7-day weekend where you can spend time on a Monday morning jogging or learning Italian or whatever, but you can spend time on a Sunday afternoon doing a report or writing up an article or something like that. So I think time, expanding time and changing it around is very, very important. The work that I do, which is between different disciplines and NGOs, there is no manager. It's that you work as a network. You give the knowledge that you have, you exchange knowledge, and that sort of attitude is really productive. It's challenging, but it's really productive, I find, and it means that you're coming up with creative ways that you would never have dreamed of. For businesses, what does creativity mean? One of the things that I think is that you can challenge what business you're in. So I noticed in the recent election debate in the States, it was about oil companies. So are oil companies in the oil business, or are they in the energy business? And we've got a great example from Ireland where Borden and Mona have changed from extracting peat or turf for burning to the management of land to generate renewable energy. So a business approach is, what business are we in? And I think that's a really creative way to start to challenge how you think about what you're doing.
Could I ask you a couple of kind of quick fire questions, if you like? Is it more difficult, Natalie, to be creative if you're working from home? If you're in your back bedroom or on the landing or whatever, and when remote working and virtual relationships are the norm?
Only if you make it so. And I say that because creativity loves constraints. And I've shared this example. I grew up in, my parents owned in our city in Philadelphia, it's called a duplex, and it's a twin home, so shared wall. But our property had two apartments, two bedroom apartments, one on the first floor, one on the second floor. And my family, family of four, we were on the second floor. My parents would rent out the first floor apartment, except for a chapter where my grandmom lived with us in the first floor apartment. But it was a tiny space. And when I talk about creativity loves constraints, my mother, especially when I reflect now as a full-grown adult, and she lives there now. My father passed away 8 years ago, and she's redesigned the space for herself. But when I go back into our bedroom and I think about how she carved out space for us to study, carved out space for us to play, carved out space for us to rest, she was just a genius for space design. And so that constraint, you could throw your hands up in the air and say, oh, we need a bigger house, which, just wasn't feasible at the time for my parents. And they made amazing magic in that space. So I say that when we have constraints on time, when we have constraints on financial constraints, which all of us deal with in various ways at certain stages, but we have constraints on people talent, that's actually where the creative energy is optimized.
Michael, I mean, have you maybe any good examples or shared software, any of that kind of thing that have acted as an enabler to creativity? I'm not sure whether Teams and Zoom and Skype and what have you fit into that category, whether they're an enabler or something which strangles it at birth sometimes, but perhaps you have some good examples.
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's completely answering your question, but we're doing on our executive MBA program at Ulster at the moment. We do live case studies for the executives who are doing innovation entrepreneurship. So two of the projects we've got at the moment are app related. So we've got a COVID symptom checker app, which is an app from Ulster University, which is trying to capture symptoms and help the obvious market that's there for that, or demand rather. And then we've got a second technology, which is a handheld water testing device, which is trying to make it quicker and easier to test for, pollutants in water, for example. So basically, we've got both technological solutions, and they're involving collecting data remotely and feeding that into systems or algorithms to help us make decisions, and the Internet of Things ultimately. So we're trying to use online ways of gathering data that can help us make decisions quicker and real time in a sense. So what our executives are doing are looking at how you bring such technologies into the marketplace or into something that's useful for people. You're looking at business models and ways that technologies can actually be used. So that activity, I think, is the practice of creativity, trying to look at a technology and see how it can be used in the real world.
Whatever the future of work looks like, and that's a bit up in the air at the moment, isn't it? There's a lot of talk about hybrid ways of working and blended working and all kinds of other expressions that we'll doubtless become as sick of as we are listening to the new normal. But whatever that new world of work looks like, Natalie, how important do you think creativity is going to be in that?
It will become increasingly essential and core to the work that we do, especially because the train's left the station. We are now in the fourth industrial revolution, which is characterized by ubiquitous technology. So whether that's artificial intelligence driving search engines, or the augmented reality app I have in my office that plays music for me, tells me the time, the weather, gives me reminders, or the reality that many hospitals now have integrated robotics into surgical rooms. The more that technology becomes saturated in our lives, the silver lining is that we can figure out opportunities for the human to show up. Because the truth is that there are going to be casualties. There will be jobs that will be lost as technology does more of the task-related work. So that behooves us to figure out ways to really use the creative genius of all of us. I interviewed our family plumber for the Creativity Leap. He was shocked he was like, why do you want to talk to me about creativity? And once he started talking, he's poetic. He talked about how he has to see what's behind the wall. All he has is his flashlight. He's a systems designer. He has to, integrate with the electricians, the carpenters, the architect, the homeowner in order to problem solve. He's totally creative. So we have to really acknowledge and then make room for and amplify all the ways that we can be creative in this world that's not so, it's here, and understand that's the opportunity to make more space and room for the human to show up.
Michael, how important would you say creativity is going to be?
I think really important. I mean, it's very interesting, the role of technology, because I've spent some time reviewing technology and the United Nations World Water Development Reports, and there's about 10 of these been done over the last 20 years. But what you've noticed is that initially it was about technological and engineering solutions for water problems. But the last report was nature-based solutions for water challenges, and they were proposing that we actually undo technologies and engineering solutions that we thought were the answer and go back with the systems that nature has dealt with to avoid flooding in the Mississippi River, for example, and erosion and things like that. So technology, it's like Angela Merkel said, technology is like an internet, like washing machines are useful things, but they have to be used in a certain way and with a human dimension. I mean, these are useful for humans. They're not useful in themselves. So my advice for creativity is to challenge assumptions about, where we're going or what you're doing, understand multiple perspectives and avoid silo thinking. And thirdly, to keep learning, to keep that investigation, that curiosity, as Natalie said, is really, really important.
And what about, Natalie, the people who may be listening to or watching this podcast who think that they're not creative, they're not among what you described as the creatives over there or wherever they may happen to be? How do you help them to discover that and nurture that skill?
Well, the first thing they could do is read my book, but aside from that, or listen to it, but aside from that, it's really to test out new ways of thinking and working. And one of the best ways to do it is to really understand how creative you are, is to do what I call become a clumsy student of something. Because one of the things that just destroys creativity is when we get into this repetitive mode, we establish our expertise, we do the same thing over and over again, and maybe that gives us a sense of faux security. But what do you like to just tinker with if you find a few hours on a Saturday afternoon? What is your hobby? So for example, I am a student of social ballroom dance. And I'm really bad at it, even though I studied dance since I was 4 years old. I studied modern dance, Horton technique. I was in the dance company in college, but I didn't go on to dance professionally. And even if I did, women dancers, shelf life is like age 30 or old. So, but I love dance. I love to dance. I love it. And so, with my lifestyle, with the demands on me, and social ballroom dance is just magic. So I study tango and foxtrot and salsa, and I'm just getting into hustle and West Coast swing a little bit now. And I have to practice the 3 I's. I have to learn to ask questions differently. Each time I have a new teacher, something clicks in a better way. I'm constantly improvising and being adaptive and looking at a movement from a different angle. I have to follow my intuition. And what's happening when I am a clumsy student of something, when everyone who's listening commits to becoming a clumsy student of something, it begins to ignite the neural synapses in your brain in regions that don't typically get exercised. And that transfers over to the work at hand that you do every single day. So I find that I don't take myself so seriously. Right? I find that I'm a little bit more comfortable asking questions to clients. I find that I'm a little bit more at ease at improvising. There's a transference when we are clumsy students of something. And that's one of the best ways to start igniting your creativity.
Oh, I'm delighted to hear that. It makes me feel so much better about being a clumsy wallpaperer of the bathroom, which I've been doing during the lockdown.
Absolutely, great
and
example.
I'm still doing.
Good.
What about you, Michael? I mean, how do you encourage people who think, oh no, yeah, that's just not for me. I'm not one of those creative types at all. How do you bring that out in them?
I think in the work that we do at the business school, a lot of the assignments are done in teams. And one of the things about teams is the realization that we're all creative, but in different ways. Some people, you find people who are very into facts and figures and statistics and want clarity about things and think in a linear way. Other people are very dynamic and radical in how they understand things, like description and understanding. So working in teams and working on real problems with real organizations, whether it's a business or an NGO or a public sector organization. That's learning by doing is the key thing, because that's where you engage with people, with other students from different backgrounds, and you can be creative in different ways. I mean, in creative problem solving, one of the things is the repeated questioning of a situation. So any situation, if you ask the word why 3 times, you often find what it really is about, or who, what, where, when, how, things like that. So repeated questioning is a very important point, because it surfaces assumptions that we have about a problem, which mightn't be the real problem. So that curiosity, I think, is really important, and challenging assumptions, I think, is really, really key to creativity in organizations.
Well, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to both of you. Thank you so much for your time today, Natalie and Michael. Thanks for joining me for this podcast, Unlocking Creativity. I'm Wendy Austin. This has been the Business of Possibility podcast with Ulster University Business School. You can stay up to date with the Business School on social media. And thank you so much for listening to the series. Bye-bye for now.